Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read, which is a non-fiction edition. I've got 5 books to talk about. So let's start with Sonic Flux, Sound, Art and Metaphysics by Christopher Cox. So, if a tree falls in a forest but no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? That old Buddhist koan. And the answer is yes, because what is sound but energy? So when you get two different types of matter who sort of rub up against each other or come into conflict, and heat and energy and sound is released. So even if you remove mankind with our listening ears from the planet, we all died out, the planet would still be making noise. The sound of the roaring sea, rivers running, the wind either through the trees or through the eaves of caves, all that sort of stuff. And this book proposes that there's what's called a constant sonic flux, whether we're tuned into that or not. That, you know, like time is a continuum, you know, you have sort of past, present and future. But whatever happens in the past has no effect in actual terms in the future. Yes, it can affect us individuals in our action. You know, if we've learned by our mistakes, we can change our behaviour. But time itself is unaffected. It still flows at the same rate. And obviously the future hasn't happened yet, so it can't have any backwards influence. And sound is the same. Sound is a constant flow at a constant rate. So even where there's silence, there's different qualities of silence, different murmuring silences. So the silence in wide open fields where there's no roads or train tracks or anything is qualitatively different to the sound inside an empty house, which is sort of obviously much more constricted space. So this concept of sound as a constant flux, and of course our interest as humans is the bits of sound such as speech or other meaningful things, you know, going back to our prehistory, you know, the sound of an animal behind us that might represent a threat or might represent food. So we're only interested in discrete sounds on this continuum, just picking out the ones that are relevant to us. And anything else we call noise or din or interference, and a lot of money and time and research is spent on things like soundproofing, sound damping, Dolby, you know, in the old days of music recording, all this sort of stuff. So that is the sort of the premise of this book, and it gets, you know, it is about metaphysics. It gets you, you know, it offers you arguments about reality, perception, who we are, and you know, shows that these basically fall into various sort of binary opposites that the philosophers over the centuries have sort of posited, and sort of undermines them, saying no, it's not that, because we don't have the basic understanding and assumption that like time, sound is a constant flux. And you know, it's open-ended in its argument. It begins to sort of tear away the veil of certain presumptions we have as human beings, and you know, it refers to people like Nietzsche, Deleuze, Bergson, Leibniz. But what I really like about this book is how accessible it makes all of that. And I just thought this was a superb read. It's also a very good sort of cataloguing of sound experimenters, sound artists, sound sculptors, whatever you want to call them, starting from the 60s. Well, it actually starts with Stockhausen, but starting from the 60s, when I wasn't really sort of aware of this sort of stuff, being only sort of 6 years old, but moving up to sort of names that I'd heard of, but didn't really know their work. People like Christian Marclay, John Cage's 433 is obviously a seminal point in our understanding our concept of sound. So just to give you an idea, you know, so this is sort of, you know, stemming from Nietzsche. Calling this field of forces the will to power, he again concludes that the world viewed from inside is will to power and nothing besides. Here too Nietzsche expresses his basic ontology in terms of a powerful unity, but this unity is now expressly a dynamic play of drives, affects, passions and forces. Nietzsche is trying to construct an ontology in which forces, powers, movements, tensions, effects and events precede the individual subjects and objects to which they are ordinarily attributed. So in a way, it's sort of not dissimilar to Marx, I suppose. It's sort of saying that, you know, rather than us sort of getting bogged down on sort of individual notions of hearing and perception, is that these sort of much more universal forces and effects and drives, which Nietzsche talked about in terms of sort of coming into being. And in a way that, again, to return to this continuum of sound, this sound flux, that, you know, as individuals we're interested in discrete bodies of sounds that may be relevant to us, but actually the bigger picture is this constant sound flux. So, you know, I got an awful lot out of this book, and I shall return to it. And onto another book about sound. This is Sonic Wonderland, a scientific odyssey of sound by Trevor Cox. And I'm just going to read you the blurb on this. This is the story of Trevor Cox's investigation to the sonic wonders of the world. In the Mojave Desert, he finds sand dunes that sing. In France, he discovers an echo that tells jokes. In California, he drives down a musical road that plays the William Tell Overture. In cathedrals across the world, he learns how acoustics change the history of the church. So that sounded really interesting to me. I was already reading this, and I spotted this in a bookshop that was closing down and thought, this is going to be a great compliment to Sonic Flux. It isn't. It's dry, it's tedious, it's repetitive. And my biggest disappointment is, I thought, you know, from that blurb, I thought a lot of these were naturally occurring sounds, you know, on this continuous sound flux, the notion of sand dunes that sing and things like that. But actually, most of them are man-made. He goes into tombs and sort of huge sort of drains and measures the reverberation of there's lots of technical stuff about reverberation and measuring that and all of that sort of stuff. I'm halfway through this book. I'm on page 154. It's going to be a DNF. One chapter I will read is the singing sand dunes, because surely not even that can be sort of man-made. So I was really disappointed. I thought this was going to be sort of natural sound without human agency, along the lines of what this was saying, and most of it isn't. It is human agented. So 5-star, do-star. The Violet Hour by Katie Roiphe. So this is a book about 5 or 6 writers and how they approached their oncoming deaths through their art. So we had Susan Sontag, James Salter, John Updike, Dylan Thomas and Maurice Sendak, and Sigmund Freud. And Roiphe herself had serious pneumonia when she was a child, about 8, and therefore faced mortality herself was acquainted with the mortality at an early age. And that has led to her investigating how other writers approached death. So Susan Sontag, who wrote Illness as a Metaphor and AIDS as a Metaphor, saying that because we won't confront death, basically, or terminal illness in the face, we come up with these metaphors to slightly distance it ourselves, and she calls for us to confront it full on, not to sort of dress it up. And yet, the point that Roiphe makes is that, you know, Sontag treated cancer twice before succumbing to a 3rd attack. And in doing so, she created the ultimate myth about her own death, which was that she was immortal, she was indestructible, she would not be claimed by death. And even though she was an arch rationalist who knew that couldn't be true, she sort of still persisted on some level of the third case of cancer is not going to claim me, you know. The trouble with this, this chapter and also the next one on Freud, is that Roiphe keeps sort of making the same point over and over and going, yeah, she's a fantasist. She denies her own death. She thinks she's immortal. We get it. You can say that in one page. You don't have to keep saying it over page after page after page after page. And it's similar with Freud, because Freud obviously was a sort of, you know, a rationalist and a scientist trying to rationalise, you know, and deal with neuroses and stuff, and was very sort of matter-of-fact about death. You know, the inevitable biological process. But his one great rebellion, his one great irrational behaviour, was even after he had cancer of the esophagus and had all these, you know, false sort of mouth implants and all this sort of stuff, he still smoked cigarettes or cigars or whatever he was smoking, full in the knowledge that A, it was uncomfortable because of all this stuff in his mouth, and B, that it, you know, it's what caused his illness in the first place. And again, she bangs on and all these quotes about Freud and smoking and his friends and colleagues talking about his smoking. You know, we get the point, Roiphe. You don't have to keep belabouring it. the other interesting thing about Freud was, of course, his work was to cure people of anxieties and fears and to re-enter them into life that they enjoyed. And if you genuinely enjoy life, you're going to be struck by horror at the thought that that life is going to come to an end, that all this joy and happiness that you've discovered is going to be taken away from you. And that's never really resolved either by Freud or by Roiphe, and really is a contradiction at the heart of the human condition. If life is so pleasurable, and admittedly it isn't for lots of people sort of suffer and have agonies of life, but if for you it is inherently pleasurable, the coming to acknowledge that that is going to come to an end is supremely inhuman or unjust, unless you're such a supreme rationalist, which apparently even Freud wasn't, that you can deal with that. The next one is Dylan Thomas, who basically refused to change his lifestyle in any way, even when he was very ill, was still drinking and shagging, and that sort of directly killed him, really. So I think we kind of knew that. I'm not sure that added anything to the pot. It was a complete denial of death or an embracing of it. What was interesting, in fact, what's interesting about all of these is the relationships left behind, the central relationships. So with Sontag, she actually had a whole ensemble of people. Freud, of course, it was his daughter Anna, who never married, never left him, sort of had an incestuous relationship without it being bodily, because Freud was her analyst as a child. There's all sorts of ethical questions about that. You know, that was a sort of incest by, through analysis type of thing. So, there was her relationship to her dad. Updike, the next one, well, Dylan Thomas was also with his wife, Caitlin, and the fact that he was sort of whoring around America and their sort of relationship. The next one is John Updike, who, when he got his terminal diagnosis, his sort of head hit the desk that he was working on and sort of just lay on the typewriter, basically, I'm done, it's over. And it was his second wife who said, no, you've got to keep writing, and she sort of motivated him and pulled him out of the slump. And now Updike was like Dylan Thomas in his early days. He was sort of, good time guy, slept with anything that moved. But his second wife, all that went out the window, and they had a very strong relationship. And she controlled the people. She controlled access to Updike once he was terminally ill. Who could visit, who couldn't. And so his first family, like his children, she was quite sort of controlling, let's put it that way, as to how much time they got to spend with him. So again, in a way, the interest was not what he wrote or not his approach to death so much through his art, but actually the relationships of those people, helping them, in those final years, days, hours kind of thing. The chapter on James Salter was almost completely redundant, I felt, because Salter was ex-Korean pilot in the Korean War, very self-contained, very self-possessed, didn't seem really to be that bothered by the notion of his upcoming death. She interviewed him in his 80s and he died a few years later. So in the gap of getting much out of Salter, she sort of fills it by returning to her own sort of hang-ups and neuroses and anxieties about death from when she was a child. So I found that really unsatisfactory. And then Maurice Sendak, basically, he was almost like Sontag in a way, that he was sort of fairly indestructible while his friends sort of fell away and died from him. And each time that sort of appeared in his work, in his drawings and his art. But again, the really interesting thing is his companion. Now, she wasn't a partner companion. She was someone who organised his life, called Lynn. In fact, her smoothing and straightening and caretaking reached the level of art itself. She says if Maurice didn't have her, he could have hired someone else to do what she did, but it seems very unlikely that he would have found someone to match the power of her caretaking, the singular grace and intelligence of it. Part of what made Lynn a superb companion for him was that she didn't try to save him or make him happy, or take his unhappiness personally. She respected his moods. She helped him live with them. She enabled his patterns without wanting to change him or believe change was possible or secretly hoping for it. This sort of profound acceptance would have been impossible for a lover, or for most people, generally, but she realised that he worked within these swings and that the work was what mattered to him. So this was a bit of an odd book, really, because I didn't really get any more insight into how artists approach death, which is something as an artist who is getting on in years, I obsess about, and my current project is about that. Although it's not about an artist. Well, I suppose it is in some sense. But anyway, so there's very little gleaned from this book about that. But what was really interesting was the relationship of these artists to their non-art partners, and how their art probably couldn't have happened without those partners absolutely selflessly sacrificing to support it. So I did find that interesting. And on to two books that in a way are sort of related. Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life, Yuyin, and The Condition of Secrecy by Christiansen. And both of these are for my Reading Women month in June. This is from my Asian author, this is from my essays. Christiansen was mainly a poet. Yuyin is a short story and novel writer. I'd read her when Reason Came to the End earlier this year, and then I picked this up, partly because of I wanted something for my Asian writer for Reading Women, but also obviously I've seen quite a few other booktubers talk about it and extol this, particularly Sean, the book maniac. So my understanding of the book wasn't quite what it turned out to be. My understanding was she was suicidally depressed, and it was only through reading about other writers that really sort of hauled her out of that. Now, I've read a book by Francis Spufford called The Books That Built a Child, or The Child That Books Built, where he talks about all his sort of reading as a child and how that made him the kind of person and the adult that he grew into. It's a really interesting book and I recommend it. And I thought this was going to be a sort of version of that, how the books that she read dragged her out of her suicidal depression. And it's in there, but it's not sort of front and central. And also, the reading she's talking about is less about fiction and poetry and more about the lives of the authors of those fiction and poetry and their letters. That seems to be what she's really interested in. And then you realise that this book is not really about the sort of suicidal depression and all of that. It's about her contemplating what it means for her to be a writer, an author, because she has a very fractured, fragmented sense of self. Her ego is not thrust out there in the world. She'd prefer to be anonymous or disappear or sort of leave no trace in the world. And yet, as an author, once you put your books into the public sphere, obviously that can't be the case. And everyone wants a piece of you, and everyone wants to ask you questions. People want your signature. Your photo appears on your books and all that sort of thing. And there's a real tension in her, in all of that. And I think that's really what the book's about. And she talks to William Trevor particularly about how he manages that, because he lives very much a recluse's life. And so she's very interested in how, and yet, inevitably, a lot of, she visits some of the areas where Trevor lived and grew up and, in Ireland, and which absolutely permeate his books, So on the one hand, she's saying that she doesn't want any of herself in her books, and that in a way she could disguise herself and remain anonymous by creating these characters who have nothing to do with her. But of course that's not true, because they are inevitably autobiographical on some level. So to give an example of that, I found this really interesting. So she wrote a book that was set in a city in Beishan in China, where she'd never actually been there. Now I can relate to this because my current novel, Three Dreams in the Key of G, is set in Omar in Northern Ireland, and I've never been to Omar, and I've never been to Northern Ireland, so I can utterly relate to this. When we entered the city, I noticed the bridge where two of my characters met for the first time, the foot of the mountain where a trusting dog was poisoned, the cooling tower of the electricity plant where a murderous janitor worked, and the river itself, befittingly muddy, fast-flowing after days of rain. I had wondered if I would notice things about the place and its people that I had not imagined while working on the novel. I did not, which was a disappointment. I do not mind that my imagination is limited. I do mind when the world is not bigger than what one can imagine. So, I really related to that. And I also relate to some extent to this tension, this push and pull of not really wanting to sort of have a public face, and yet inevitably, being an author, you do become public property, or your books certainly do. And then there's all the questions of, well, is this you? Is this autobiographical? How much of this is in you? I don't think I'd go to quite the extreme that she does in sort of denying that she's in her books at all. But I can relate to that. There's a really interesting section where she talks about the fact that, you know, her experiences and life and upbringing in China was so horrendous psychically that when she came to America, she wanted to, you know, unlearn Chinese and you know, refuse to speak the language ever again, which I think has raised lots of controversy, particularly on booktube. You know, I think people have the right to completely ditch their upbringing and their identity that was conferred on them in childhood, as long as they're not doing it for sort of, you know, purposes of criminality, you know, to create false identities. But, you know, I don't understand that, you know, that we, you know, people are supposed to relish and celebrate their cultural heritage and upbringing. Well, not if they don't want to, not if it makes them feel uncomfortable. I suppose it's like, you know, being born, feeling you've been born in the wrong body. Well, how's it any different to that? It took me a year to, if you can be articulate about your thoughts, why can't you articulate your feelings? Asked the doctor. It took me a year to figure out the answer. It's hard to feel in an adopted language, yet it is impossible to do that in my native language. And then this split between, you know, the thinking author and the you know, writing feelings is something that Clarice Lispector in her fiction, you know, revisits all the time. And I think it's a hugely interesting question, because by the very nature of producing a novel or poetry and having to sort of structure and order your thoughts to fit in the case of poetry with rhyme and metre and all that sort of thing, or in the case of novels, the structure of the narrative, you know, that is an intellectual exercise. And yet somehow in that, through that thinking, you have to sort of produce and exude feeling and emotions for the reader to, you know, to experience. It's again, you know, those are important questions undoubtedly for authors. As I say, Lispector does it right in the heart of her fiction, and in here Lee considers it as part of her musings in this book. And finally, just again, this is about her sort of wanting not really to sort of have a presence in the world, not to be noticed, to go by unnoticed, to go by invisible, I suppose. I've been asked throughout my life, what are you hiding? I don't know what I'm hiding, and the more I try to deny it, the less trustworthy people find me. My mother used to comment on my stealthiness to our guests. A woman in charge of admission at the public bathhouse often confronted me, asking what I was hiding from her. Nothing, I said, and she would say she could tell from my eyes that I was lying. Reticence is a natural state. It is not hiding. People don't show themselves equally and easily to all. Reticence doesn't make one feel lonely as hiding does, yet it distances and invalidates others, which I think is a really interesting insight. And again, though, you want to be reticent, you don't feel you want to necessarily have to have an opinion or have to say anything, and yet you're a writer. And it's going to be demanded of you. First of all, you are saying things in your books, even if you claim it not to be you talking but your characters, which I don't think really holds up. But if you're on a panel talking about your book, which he finds really uncomfortable, you know, you can't be reticent. So, you know, this is a really good book, but it wasn't quite the book I thought it was going to be. This is a book about writing, really, or about being a writer. So I give it sort of 4 stars. I think it would be more interesting for me if the stuff about how words and literature and fiction pulled her out of, you know, her suicidal depression. But in a way, fiction didn't. It was more about the real lives of other authors. And yet she doesn't want a life of an author herself. That's never really quite resolved. And I will say that, going back to When Reason Came to an End, a lot of that follows on from this, but a lot of it is in direct contrast and conflict with this, because that's a book about the suicide of her son. I won't talk any more about it in relation to this. I do have a review of that. I will post it. I really liked When Reason Came to an End. I liked its tone. I liked its literary values. But but in retrospect, when you read this, it's a bit of an odd experience because it goes against a lot of what she writes about in here. So, and finally, Christiansen, The Condition of Secrecy. So in the middle of this are 4 really, really strong essays. They are The Condition of Secrecy, In the Beginning Was the Flesh, It's All Words, and The Naive Reader. And they're all about sort of the sublime origins of poetry, and the more we look for where sort of creativity and poetry comes from, the more foggy and cloudy it becomes. It's a plea really to let them just exist in their own, not to try and sort of analyse it out of existence, but just to revel in the products of poetry and stuff. After that, there's some essays about sort of the 80s and the fact that we've all faced sort of mutually assured destruction under the nuclear threat, and then eventually that how that sort of passed into the collapse of communism, which I don't think are particularly good essays, but they do remind me that I lived through those as well in my 20s, and it's amazing how mentally in my own mind how far away we've moved from that. In a way we haven't, because a lot of those threats still exist. There's probably more potential conflict zones in the world right now. The nuclear threat still exists. Russia is back to its sort of imperial colonising. The fact that it's no longer a sort of Soviet communism, it's under sort of Putin. So it did sort of make me stop up short, think, God, yeah, how can I have not forgotten, but put to the back of my mind, in my 20s, I joined CME. These things are important to me. And now in my 50s, they just seem like ancient history, and they're not, because they're still current. So I don't really, again, I don't want to sort of do what she asks us not to do, which is sort of over-analyse, the nature of creativity and language and poetry. But I do want to just read this. This is the beginning to the essay called It's All Words. The word creates what it names. But what does it mean when we say that a word, by naming something, creates that something? Can I, just by mentioning the word rose, bring a rose into being somewhere? No, of course, I can't. I can't say rose and poof, hocus pocus, a rose appears in the visible world. That kind of thing happens only in the world of fairy tales, where things regularly happen as soon as the right word is said. Hocus pocus, and the rose hedge bursts into bloom. Open sesame, and the mountain opens. Table, set yourself, and all sorts of the tastiest dishes are served forth. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. I think that's quite subversive, where she sort of, slid from fairy tales to the Bible, equating that the Bible is a fairy tale. So that's quite nice. Anyway, but as I said, that kind of thing only happens in the world of fairy tales. In the world of fantasy, the whole world of our thoughts and imaginings. And in this inner world, the word does create what it names. It's in this world of imaginings that I can say rose, and if I close my eyes, a rose will appear before my inner eye, maybe not entirely as visible as it would be in a garden, but visible. And if I open my eyes again and say rose, as I'm doing while I prepare this talk, one rose after another will appear, a whole world of roses in my memory. The first rose that my boyfriend ever gave me, the bouquet of roses when my son was born, rose gardens here and there in the world, the great rose window at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and the rose catalogue I used when I was writing my novel Azorno. So I think that's really interesting. This is about sort of nominalism, where giving names to things, nouns group things together. And I've talked about this elsewhere. And here she sort of says, you use the word rose, and, in your memories are actual roses on the occasion of birth of the sun, first love, but also the representation of a rose in a stained glass window in a church. And that's where, yes, it's a rose, but it's made of glass. It's not an organic rose made out of, chlorophyll and DNA and all of that. So there's that. As it is now, when the world has existed for so long, words come from everywhere, and they're never there for the first time. Not only that, although there may not be an infinite number of them, nor an infinite number of combinations, nevertheless, there is an inexhaustible landscape of words. There are more than any one individual could manage to travel through. This is where it ends and where it begins, if a person is going to write poems. in the imagined concept of this mysterious landscape, for poems are created exclusively from words. And then she goes on to talk about, you know, how do poets make choices between words when they're writing their poem. And she, as she has throughout the book, she's talking about the sort of sublime process. It's not something you can nail down and look at under a microscope. So I gave this 4.5, well, 4 or 4.5. It depends whether, you know, as I say, some of the essays weren't of interest, but the ones that were, those 4 in the middle, were superb. 4, I gave this 4 out of 5 because, again, it wasn't quite what I thought it was. I gave that 3 or 3.5. I gave that 5. And I gave that a miserable 2. And Will Be did not finish, but I feel I've read enough of it, plus the one chapter I've got to go, that I could grade it. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.